and welcome to my channel. So on our last lectures we are able to create our forms.py for our vendor registration form. But before we continue, we're gonna make some changes to our vendor form. So I'm going to go to my vendor app. This is the vendor app here, and then you can just expand it and then open your forms.py. Now the first changes we're gonna make is in here, this vendor type forms.select. This is not gonna work because select is a widget, and in Django all widgets must be defined within the meta class. So you can take up this code or you can just comment it out, and then what you have to do is come below here and then type help underscore text equals, you open a curly brace which is a dictionary, and then in quotes you type this vendor type, put it inside the quotes, and then you say semicolon, please select your vendor type. Now this is not the first lesson in this tutorial series. We have 10 lessons already, so if you've not watched previous lessons, I suggest you go back and watch the previous lessons so you understand what we're trying to do. Okay, so this is the first couple of changes. So let me remove this so my code will be more visible for you. Now I'm just gonna take this off. Now the next couple of changes we're gonna make is in here we're gonna make some addition. So here we have said that vendor license equals forms.file field, label equals vendor license. So beside this vendor license, we will have this right of vendor license so that the user will know that that field is meant to upload their vendor license. Now we said help text equals please your vendor license, image only. Now how do we make sure that the vendor is able to upload an image only field? So we will write some functions so that to restrict the user from uploading only images. So now we would, let me expand this back and then reduce the size of my code. So now we will write a function called validators.py. Your validators, you can put it anywhere you like. So for the sake of this tutorial, I'm gonna put my validators inside my authentication app. So I will show you how to call it. You can put the validators inside authentication app, inside book and write folder, which is a main project folder. You can put it inside the vendor folder as well. But right now we're working on this vendor registration form, but I'll put the validators on my authentication app and then use it inside this vendor app, so you know how to call functions. So the first thing you have to do is go to your authentication app here, and then you can expand it. Just right click and then click on new file, call it validators.py. that is a Python file. So yeah, open it now. Okay, I've already written the code, but I'm gonna just remove it. So yeah, this is validators.py. Now the first thing you have to do is to make some imports. So you say from Django dot core dot exceptions. import validation error. I'm gonna explain all the codes for you. Then the next thing you want to do is to import OS. Import OS. And then you define a function in Python and Django. You define a function by typing def. Then you give it a function name. So I will call mine allow image underscore validators. Yeah, so now while defining functions in Python, you can't use space. So for example, you can't say def allow image validators. No, you can't give space, and you can't use special characters to separate words by maybe slash, forward slash, or backward slash. No, but you can separate names in your function using underscore. So I'm gonna call mine def allow image only validators, and then this, put in your parameter value, semicolon. Now the next thing you want to do is extension ext equals os dots paths, and then dots split text, then value dot name, square bracket 1. I will explain the code when I finish typing everything. So I can print the extension. This I'm just trying to get the extension of the file that is selected. Now I declare another variable valid underscore extension. Now your variable names can be anything, so you can call this whatever you want. This function name as well, you can call it whatever you want. So valid extension equals square brackets in quotes dot jpg. These are the only file extension I want. Put comma dot png, comma quotes dot jpeg, and then I'll write some conditional statement here. If not extension dot lower. In valid extension raise validation error, then my message unsupported file formats selected. Then you can only select, I'm just gonna come down here, you can only select select plus str valid extension. Yeah. So yes, this is our code to allow only images. So let me explain now. Now this line from Django.exception imports from Django.core.exception import validation error. So this line imports the validation error class from Django core exception module. So these are pre-made classes from Django, and then we are importing it. Validation error is used to raise an error when the validation condition is not met. So at this point, now I said valid extension is just JPEG, PNG, and JPG. Now, my conditional statement, I said if not extension dot lower in validation extension, raise validation error. So this import that we made is going to raise a validation error once the file that is selected is not any of these formats. Now I said if not extension dot lower, this will convert whatever file extension you've selected into lower to create a uniform data types. Now you could have something like this, my picture dot png, and then you can also have something like my picture dot png. Now this is small letters, this is capital letter, so this extension dot lower will convert any file that you selected. It will get the extension of that file through this code, and then it will convert the extension of that file to lower. So whether you pick lower characters or you pick upper characters, it doesn't matter. It will convert it to lower and check if the extension matches with one of these. So converting to lower character will enable us not write multiple line of code to check if it's uppercase PNG or if it's lowercase PNG, if it's uppercase JPEG or if it's lowercase JPEG or JPG as well. So whatever file format you select, it converts it to lower, and then it checks if the extension is one of these here. That's why I said if not extension dot lower in valid extension, raise validation error. Now os.paths.splitText value.name, then this is a tuple 1. So it means this is a function that splits the value.name into a tuple. When you put something inside a square bracket, it becomes a tuple. So I declared a tuple. So now so what this is gonna do, if you select a file named img.png, it's going to split it, and the value will be img, which is the file name, and then the extension would be png. The reason why we declare this as a tuple is because using a tuple is the most appropriate data structure to use in this case. So we have dictionaries, we have lists, we have tuples, but I'm using tuple because a tuple is a simple and lightweight data structure that can efficiently hold a fixed number of elements, and in this case the file name and the extension are a pair of values that are fixed. So we don't want the file name to change, neither do we want the file extension to change when the user selects the image. So tuples are immutable. That means they cannot be changed once they are created. So using tuple here is the best data structure to use. Now we've created a function to allow image only. So if the file extension is not JPG, PNG, or JPEG, is not going to accept it. So we have to use it now on our forms. forms.py. So you save the file, go to file, click on save all, and then go to your vendor app, which is this, and then open the forms.py. So remember, we wrote the function inside authentication app, and we created a file called validators.py. So to use it inside another app, you have to import it. Now, this is how to import it. Type from authentication. Authentication because we wrote it inside authentication app. Authentication dot validators. Authentication dot validators. Then you import the function. Say import. What is the name of the function? Let me click on it. Allow image only validators. So I'll go back to my vendor app, go to my forms.py, then I type allow image only validators. Now you go towards the end of this vendor license, because this vendor license is a file and we want the user to upload only image objects. So come to this point. At this point, you open bracket and close the brackets, and then you put a comma, and then let me collapse this so it's gonna be clearer. Give a space, and then you type validators equals, open a square bracket, then you type allow image only validators. So this is it. So it means vendor license, it's only image that the user can upload. Now remember that on our user registration form as well, there's a field, there's an image field, this profile picture. So I went to my authentication app and I went to my forms.py because we use this form for the user profile registration. So there is also an image field, which is profile picture, and there is cover photo. So we also need to use the allow only image validators. So you have to come to this top part where you should import it. Now you say from. You no longer say authentication, rather you can say dots, from dots, validators, import, allow only image validators. This time around I use dots because validators.py and my forms.py, they are inside the same directory, which is the authentication directory. So that's why I use dots. However, if you say from authentication dot validators, import allow image only validators, is still going to work, but it's waste of time, typing this authentication all over again. So you can just use dots. But if you are calling these validators on a different app, like we did here in our vendor forms.py, that's when you need to type out the full parts. So I'll go back to my authentication and then I'll go back to my forms. So here I've imported it. Now what you need to do, look for the image fields. Here profile picture equals image field. So open brackets, open and close, and then put a comma, and then type validators equals square brackets, then allow image only validators. So this field as well is just gonna allow only image. Come to this point as well, bracket open and close, comma, then validators equals square brackets, allow image only validators. That's it. Save all And then so we can go back to our vendor app now, forms.py. So this is the few corrections I want to make or improvement I wanted to make. And so now we have to write our function in our views.py to connect our backend to our front end. So when the user fill in the form, it's gonna save on our database. So we'll do that. We'll go to views.py and then we'll write some functions here. Now for this vendor registration function, I'm gonna take a little bit different approach. I'm gonna make my code a little bit different from the customer registration function. So if you see such kind of code, you will understand what it does. So the first thing you want to do is to define your function. So I type def and then give it a function name. I'm just gonna call mine vendor reg. You can call yours whatever you want, and then in here I will type request, then semicolon, press enter, and then you type return render bracket open and close request, then you state the paths where your vendor registration HTML is going to be. So I'll open a quote, I'll type vendor, so it's going to be inside vendor folder, then / the name of your registration form.html. So I want to give mine vendor reg.html. So vendor can be anything. Vendor reg can also be anything you want. This means that my vendor reg.html is inside a folder called vendor. So you have to go to your templates now, click on templates, and then create a folder and call it vendor. So this folder now, this name is what I'm calling this vendor. And then inside the vendor folder, create a file called vendorreg.html. So I'll go back to my templates, vendor. I'm just gonna delete this. This is not a folder. So right click on the templates, new folder, and call it vendor. And then inside this vendor folder, right click on it, create a new file called vendorreg.html. So that's how the template system works in Django. I'll go back to my code. This vendor, on my templates folder, I created a folder called vendor, and then I created vendorreg.html inside the vendor folder. So this is the vendor app. Let me minimize this. This is my template folder. This is the vendor folder, and this is vendorreg.html inside my vendor folder. So we'll continue with the code now. Now I'm having an error on my render because we need to import the render function. So you type from Django.shortcuts, import render. I'm just gonna import redirect as well. Redirect. Yeah. So the error is gone now. Now I'll write a conditional statement. If request dot user dot is authenticated, messages dot warning. You are already registered. Now, it means when the user goes to this vendor registration page, the application is going to check if the user is already logged in. If the user is already logged in, it's not going to allow the user create a new account again. Rather, it's going to display a message telling the user that you are already registered. So now I have an error on my messages because we need to import this messages class. Come to this place and type from Django.contrib import messages. From Django.contrib import messages. So it's going to import the messages framework, so the error is gone. Now at this point, if the user is authenticated, it should display this warning message. Then what is it going to do? Let the application redirect the user back to the home page or back to maybe the dashboard or wherever. So type return redirect and then home. So it's going to redirect the user back to the home page. We are able to use redirects here because we've already imported it from Django, the shortcut import render, comma, and redirect. That's why we are able to use this. And we are calling this home because there is a function called home. So this function, it's on our, let me show you. Go inside your book and write folder and views.py. This is it, home. This is the home function, and then if you go to the URL, you'll see the name home. So this function, when you go to your views.py, you'll see it returns redirect to home.html. So it means before the user will be able to register as a vendor, it will check if the user is already logged in, because some people, they don't really know how to use the application. They may be already signed up and then they'll try to create a new account. So it's just going to check and redirect the user back to the home page. Now press enter and type elif request dot method equals post. This is double equals to, and put this in quotes. So declare a variable. I'll just call mine form equals, I have to import the forms now that we created inside these forms. So the first form I'm going to import is this vendor form. I'll go back to my views.py, come to this top part and type from dot forms import vendor form, comma, vendor registration as well. If I go back to my forms, this is vendor form. Okay, I just have one form here, so go back, remove this. Form equals vendor form, then request dot post, so the next form I want to import is the user register form as well, because I want while creating your vendor account, you should also create a user account. So I'm going to go to my user creation form is here, is in Authentication app, forms.py. This user register form, So I'll go back to my vendor app and my views.py, and then I'll type from authentication.forms import user profile. I'll just have to check if it's correct. Authentication.forms. Okay, user register form. I have user register form. I also have user profile. So I'm going to import the two in my vendor app forms. Go back to my views.py, user profile, comma, user registration. So this user register form is the one that we'll use for the password and the username to create their account. And this is gonna be their profile, their first name, surname, last name, and other details. So now I say form equals vendor form request.post. The vendor forms is in this vendor app forms.py. Now let me call this v form, v underscore form. This is a variable name, so you can call it whatever you want. Then I'll call this, let me call this form. Form equals user register form request.post, comma, request.files. I use request.files because on this user registration form, they need to select their profile picture and their profile picture. Now the last form I'm going to pick is this one, user profile. So I'll say profile form equals user profile request.post. Now remember, each form that has a file input, like the user have to upload an image or PDF or any file, you must add request.files. Now this vendor form, v form equals vendor form. Let's go to the form. This is it, vendor form. I have a file input field, vendor license file field. So I have to make this one request.files. Request.files. Now this form equals user register form. I'm just gonna call this user form. It's in my authentication app. I'll go to my form, user register form don't have any file input field, so I would remove the request.files. View, remove it in here, and then profile form, it's also on my authentication app. Go to my views and now go to forms.py, and this is the profile form. It has a file field, an image field. So I'll go back to my views. So I'll have to add request.files. Okay, that's it. So I've imported all my form. This is for the vendor form to capture the vendor license and other information about the vendor. Then this is the user form, because the vendor is also an individual, which maybe is registering for his company or is an individual. They also have to create their registration details, like their password and their username, so they can log in. So this form is the one responsible for the email, the sign up, and then the last one is profile form. Because they are also individuals, we need to capture their first name, their surname, and their last name. So there is better and more complex way to do this stuff, but because I'm trying to make my tutorial simple, I'm just gonna do it this way that everyone is gonna understand. So yeah, now the next thing we have to do is to check if these forms are valid. So you type your if statements. So the first one is going to be if vform dot is underscore valid and user form dot is underscore valid and profile form dot is underscore valid. So this will check if the forms is valid. Form validity, we have field errors and non-field errors. So for example, in this form, maybe the user forgot to put @ in the email field, then the form is not valid. Or maybe the username that the person is imputing already exists, the form is not, or the form wouldn't be valid. So if it's not valid, it should throw an error message. So this is how to check exception handling in Python and Django to check if all the inputs are valid. So you type password equals form dot cleaned data, cleaned underscore data, square brackets, password 1. Now the next thing you have to type is password equals user form dot cleaned data, square brackets, password 1. Now remember, I told you this user form is the one responsible for capturing the email and password of the user, and this user form is a variable which inherits this user register form. Now I'll go to my authentication app and let's see what is inside this user register form. I'll go to forms, user register form. So we have username, email, password 1 and password 2. Now I'll go back, views. So I'm saying password equals user form dot clean data password 1. So it should capture password 1 from this form. So when this form renders on the HTML templates, it's going to capture the password 1 and pass it to a variable called password. Now this is not completely necessary, because when we created our function for our user registration, we didn't do this. But I'm bringing up this code so that in the event you see it somewhere else, maybe you're maintaining an already existing application and you see this kind of code, you're not going to be confused. We can go ahead and save these forms without doing this, but this is a way to capture the imputed password into a variable called password. Now this password 1 is the field inside this user register form, which I showed you on my authentication app. The next thing you have to do is to declare another variable. I'm just gonna call it user. So user equals user form dot save. I will say commit equals false. Now commit equals false is used when you want to capture other attributes inside a form and then maybe use it somewhere else. So at this point, the form is ready to be saved, but not yet saved into the database, because we want to pass this password that we've captured inside this password. We want to pass this password 1, which we captured inside a variable called password, and pass it to the user. So the next code I'm going to do is, I will say user dot sets underscore password, then password. So this is what we did. We captured the input, the password input, saved it inside a variable called password. And then we said user, this is just a variable which holds this user form dot save. We are saving it, but commit equals false. It shouldn't save into the database yet, because we want to carry out other functions. Now we say user dot set password equals password. So this user that is registering now, this password that is being imputed inside this password 1 will be passed to this user. So this is one way to capture a password field or any field and assign it to the user. Now the next thing we want to do is user.role equals user.vendor. Now let me explain this. Now user is a variable that is holding this user form. Now let's go to our authentication app, and then we go to our form. So this user is a variable and it holds this user form. And remember, this user form up here is a variable that holds user registration form. So this is the main form. We've passed this user register form to user form. Then at this point, because we want to pass other attributes to the user, we declared another variable called user equals user form.save. Now this user form is this user register form. If you go to the authentication app, go to the forms, you will see user register form. This is it, user register form. Now it's using a model called user. So if you go to the models.py inside authentication app, you will see it's user. And now this user model has a variable called role. Look at it, role. Now that's why at this point on my views.py, I said user.role equals user.vendor. Now I'll go back to my models. You will see role equals models.positive small integer field, choices equals role choice. I've already explained this on the previous video. Now if you go to role choice, this is the role choice: vendor, customer, and driver. These are the choices. Now go back to views.py. So there's an error on this user because we need to import the model. So you go to your top bar and say from authentication dot models import user. That's it. So the error is gone now. So at this point, you can now save the user.save. So we've completed saving our user form. So I started with this user form. Now I can do for this as well. It doesn't matter the order. No, so the next thing you have to do is press enter, and then you type a variable name. I'll just call this vendor. Let me call it something not similar. I'll just call it the vendor. So this is a variable name. You can call yours whatever you like. The vendor equals vform. Vform dot save commit equals false. Now, yeah, I'm saving it, but I'm not committing it yet because I need to pass some values to some of the fields. Press enter. Then I now say vendor, the vendor dot user equals user. I will explain. Now you see the vendor equals vform. This vform equals vendor form. So this is a variable which I am passing this vendor form to a variable called vform. So let's go to this vendor form now. Go to your vendor model, your vendor app, and go to the forms.py. This is the vendor form. Now this vendor form, which model is it using? It is using vendor registration. So I'll go to my models.py. So this is it, vendor registration. Now on this vendor registration, you can see that one of the fields it has is called user, this user. That's why on my views.py, on my function, I said the vendor.user equals user. Where is this user coming from? This user is coming from here. This user I just created. So not to confuse you, I'm just gonna change this to something else so that it wouldn't have the same name. So I'll call this the user equals user form. Copy this, call this back the user dot set password equals password, the user. So now the vendor dot user will be the user, so you don't get confused with the naming. So when I go to my models, I'm saying it has a field called user equals models.one-to-one field user. This user is calling from my authentication. It's calling from this authentication model. This is it, this user model. So now I'll go back to my views.py. So because I want to pass the user to this vendor form, that's why I said commit equals false at this stage. Now the next thing I want to do is the vendor dot user underscore profile equals the user. Okay, let me do something. Let me do this serially. So while the vendor is registering, this should be first. So this is the one that this form is what they're gonna use for their email and their password. This will be first, and then the next one is going to be their profile, which is their username, their first name, their post or zip code, and all the rest. And then the last is going to be the vendor form. So now this user form, I've done it for this. So this is for this first one, and then let me handle their profile form first before I do their vendor form. So I'm just gonna give some space. Leave this code here the way it is. We'll come back to it. Now the next thing we have to do is say profile, declare a variable name. Profile equals what? What is it going to be? Profile form. Profile form. Profile form dot save and commit equals false. Now profile dot user equals the user. Then you say profile dot save. Now I've saved their user profile. So I'm just gonna put a comment hash saving the profile of the vendor. Now let me explain. So we declared a variable called profile form, and then it's holding this our user profile form. Now I'll go to my authentication app and go to the forms. You see profile form. This is it, profile form. So it has first name, last name, date of birth, address. So this form will be used to store all these informations about the vendor. Now I'll go back to my vendor app and my views. So in here I said profile equals the profile form, which is this profile form. Then I said dot save, commit equals false. Now I said profile dot user equals the user, because this profile, which is this profile form, in its model it has a field called user. So let's look at the model now. Go back to your authentication and go back to your forms and go back to your profile form. This is the model it's using, user profile. Now this user profile model, we can find it inside authentication app and models.py, and then scroll down. This is it, user profile. So this user profile, it has a field called user, which is a one-to-one field that is calling from this user model. So that's why on the vendor app and views.py we said profile.user, because it has a field called user equals the user. So we've already created the user here. That's why we have to pass this user to this profile before we say profile.save. So this one is for this profile form, while this one we did is for this our user form. What is remaining is this vendor form, which we've already started. So now you can come back and say the vendor.user profile equals profile. So the profile that is already created should be passed to this vendor, and this vendor is this v form. Now you go to the vendor, you go to forms. This is it, vendor form. Go back to my views. This v form is this variable above that is holding this vendor form, and this vendor form, it's inside this vendor app forms.py. This is the vendor form, and the vendor form is using a model called vendor registration. Now if you go to the vendor registration on my models.py, vendor registration, it has a field called user profile and user. That's why on the views.py on the function we say the vendor.user, because of that user field it has, equals the user, this user, while the vendor.user profile equals this profile that we just created for the vendor. Now the next thing we have to do is to get the vendor name. I'm going to write the code first before I start explaining. So I'll type a variable called the vendor name equals v underscore form dot cleaned data, and then square brackets, which is used to declare dictionary, comma, vendor name. So I'm going to explain this. I declared a variable called vendor name. I say v underscore form dot clean data vendor name. So this v form has a field called vendor name. This clean data method is going to validate that field to make sure that the input is valid. And also, clean data, it's used to remove it is going to format the text, remove white spaces, and make sure that the data is consistent, remove white spaces and all the rest. So this vendor form, let me go to the form. This is a vendor form. It's using a model called vendor registration. So if you go to the models.py, you see vendor registration. It has a field called vendor slug. And if I go back to my views.py, I want to get this vendor name, concatenate it with the vendor ID, and then pass it to this field called vendor slug. That's what I'm trying to do. Now, I explained in my previous video that this vendor slug, we will use it to create a unique identifier for each vendor. So if we have a vendor called ABC Restaurants, or ABC Hotel, and we have another vendor called ABC Hotel as well, the vendor slug for this is going to be ABC Hotel 2, and this is maybe ABC Hotel 3. So this 2 is the ID and this 3 is the ID. So when vendor 1 registers as ABC Hotel, the ID will be 2. So we are adding, or we are concatenating, the vendor name and the ID. So that's what I'm trying to do. Now I'll go back to my views.py. Now the next thing I'll do, I'll say the vendor dot vendor slug. This vendor slug is coming from my model here, vendor slug. The vendor.vendor slug equals slugify this vendor name, slugify this vendor name, plus empty string, put a dash, plus str the user dot id, put it inside here, the user dot id. So every user has an ID. So here we've created the user account for this vendor, and so now I'm saying the user, so this will be the vendor, copy this, the vendor dot vendor slug equals slugify the vendor name, this vendor name that we captured in here, plus str the user, this user that we created, and the ID, the user.id. Now we need to import this slugify model. So go to your top area section where you have all your imports, and then you type from Django.templates, dot default filters, import slugify. So once you do this error will be gone. Now the last thing you want to do is the vendor dot save. And then once it's saved, you display a message. So I'm saying messages dot success request your vendor account has been created successfully. So your message can be whatever you want. Your vendor account has been created successfully. And then return redirects home. When we create the dashboard for the vendor and the user, once the account has been created, we are going to redirect the user to the dashboard page. But for now, I'm just going to redirect to the home page. We are able to use this redirect because we've imported it here. Look at it. From Django.shortcuts, import render, import redirect. Yeah, so profile form dot errors. Yeah, that's it. Now remember, I have another if statement. There's an if statement again. So if request.user is authenticated, this is the first one, and this is my nested if statements. Now scroll down, come to this line, this indents on this elif indents. Keep your cursor here, press enter, and then you type else. I'm just gonna make my screen bigger, my code bigger. Else you type so copy this, user form equals user register form, come to this point, else, enter, go back, just copy this so you don't make a mistake, profile form equals user profile, same thing, enter, you go back and then you copy this. So on this function we learned how to work with three forms. We combined three forms. So that's it. So it means if request.method is equals to post, it should render this form and then perform all these actions. But if the request.method is not post, it shouldn't perform these actions. Rather, it should just render these forms again. Now, the last thing you want to do is to put these forms inside a context dictionary. So if you don't put it inside a context dictionary, you cannot use it inside this vendor reg.html. Now, to put it inside the context dictionary, keep your indentation on the same line as this else statement. Now you can just call it context, but you can call it whatever you want. Open curly brace. Some people use data, but you can call it whatever you want, absolutely whatever you want. But I'm just gonna leave it at data. So you give a variable name. I'm just gonna call it open the quotes. I'm just gonna call it user reg form. colon this. You copy this user registration form, Control Z. Then you put a comma. You have to pass all these forms inside the context dictionary. Now the next one, I'm gonna call it profile form. This profile form. This is key and value. Key and value. This, your key name can be anything at all, but I'm just calling it something that is related to the form. Put a comma as well, and then I'll call it vendor form, comma, vendor form. Yeah. So now you need to pass this data, copy this data, come to this point, put a comma and paste it. So this data, all these forms will be accessed inside this vendor reg.html. If you don't do it like this, by defining a context dictionary, you will not be able to access these forms inside this vendor reg.html. So this video is already too long. I'm just gonna stop these lectures here, and then on our next lecture we will create our urls.py, and then we'll also create the code. We'll render this form inside our vendor reg.html and then try to fill it out and save it into the database. If everything works, we'll also do the registration for the drivers. So a registration form that drivers can use to register on our platform and list their vehicles on their platform. And then after that, we'll start designing the HTML pages. We'll start designing our pages using HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, and JavaScript. And then we'll also create the dashboard for the vendors, for the users, for the drivers. And then we'll start to implement other functions. So I'm just gonna end this video here, and in the coming days I will drop the next video. Now while you're watching this video, if the quality is low, simply open your video, come to this settings tab, and then click on quality, and then choose 720p. Sometimes you may see HD. If you see high definition, click on it and the quality is going to be better for you. And then don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that when I drop the next video, you're gonna have a notification. If you have any issues, you have any questions, or you run into any bugs, drop it on the comment section. And then if you can't fix it, you can simply send me an email. I'm gonna help you. So this is my email. And then yeah, like and share my videos if you like my content, and then I'll see you again in the coming days. Thank you very much, and bye bye.